get more on what's happening in Ukraine now and the position that the United States and NATO are taking at the moment. I'm joined now by Mark Voyger, who's a former Special Advisor for Russian and Eurasian Affairs to the Commanding General of US Army Europe. Very good to talk to you, Mr. Voyger. A lot to get through. Let's start then, first of all, with the NATO approach. And this takes in no-fly zones and other issues as well. And it's through an interview that you may have seen Sky News conducted today with the former NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who more or less, I paraphrase, more or less says that the NATO is going to have to confront Russia now or later, perhaps sooner than many people in NATO at the moment imagine.
Well, this is absolutely true, and the sooner the NATO nations come to this realization, the better. Mr. Rasmussen is not the only voice out there. There are many other former senior NATO officials, both on the US side and the European continent, who actually advocate for NATO to take a more direct role. Of course, as we all know, NATO needs a consensus of 30 nations. So sometimes, quite often, unfortunately, it's quite difficult to gather, to garner this consensus, especially on a controversial issue such as this. But after all, NATO is the most successful alliance of democracies, and if we are to protect and spread democratic values, we need to, put our, to really pull our act together and be, be ready to engage in some form. It doesn't have to be, obviously a full-scale military action, but there are many nuances. There are many modalities in which NATO can contribute. First, to the defense of its Eastern European members and NATO as a whole, and of course, in preventing the humanitarian catastrophe which is quickly evolving before our eyes in Ukraine.
Well, expand on that. You say NATO will or may have to take a more direct role. I mean, the most obvious one being discussed at the moment is some form of no-fly zone, perhaps one to enforce humanitarian corridors.
Correct. Those corridors can take many forms. I mean, it could mean establishing a no-fly zone over Kiev, some of the other major cities, especially Western Ukraine. This is an area which the Russians will never penetrate in terms of ground forces, and therefore, it's of utmost importance to keep Western Ukraine at least, shielded in some form against potential Russian missile and airstrikes. Obviously, in order to protect the population there, but also to protect the potential supplies, actual supplies that are coming from Europe into Ukraine. We should not forget that Russia also controls the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, that in Zaporozhye, and then, of course, the Chernobyl reactor, which, if compromised, could lead to a catastrophe of global proportions. There's no exaggeration in saying that. And therefore, we have an obligation not only on humanitarian terms, but really on pure rational terms. I mean, Europe is not such a large continent. We have to keep in mind that the Russians are acting extremely irresponsibly around and playing with fire, dealing with those nuclear reactors. And of course, every day we see terrible scenes of barbaric attacks against children's hospitals, against civilian targets, which is completely unacceptable. And if we don't act now, we'll be forced to act in the future, just like we did in Yugoslavia and elsewhere.
And what about the threatened use of chemical weapons? Some dire warnings. We heard them again today from the British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. We've heard them from the State Department and indeed from the White House. If Russia deployed chemical weapons in Ukraine, would that be a red line that merited a response from NATO?
Absolutely. I mean, I know that red lines were not, complied with in Syria, but chemical weapons, WMD, used on the European soil, that would be more than a red line. That would mean that really we have to go all in any way we can to actually prevent that.
All in. I mean, does this? I mean, taking out the units that drop now, whatever form they come in. That means attacking Russian forces.
That would not be of our own. That would not be an action of our own choice. The Russians will, if they go that route, they will force us to act. I mean, remember, NATO acts by consensus, but ultimately it's also prone to, obviously the public opinion is able to change the calculus within NATO, something that may have looked, really not very rational until some, certain period of time. Think of Yugoslavia. Think of how the decision making within NATO evolved in a direction to actually launch strikes against Yugoslavia and ultimately take down Milosevic.
Well, I mean, just to end this, because we've been talking about escalation and escalation in horrifying ways, what about de-escalation? What do you read into the various diplomatic contacts that are taking place today, the most visible in Turkey between the foreign ministers? We know that there are other contacts between Israel and Russia, now South Africa. We hear that the former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, who has connections, obviously, with Russia. He's in Moscow tonight. Do you have any hopes of something developing there?
Remember, Russia did not launch an invasion of Ukraine in order to sue for peace. Unfortunately, peace negotiations are part of Russia's hybrid warfare tactics. That is, they are tactics to delay and regroup. I mean, obviously, they've had serious problems on the ground. So the only terms that Russia would accept, the only peace terms, are its own terms. That is, depriving Ukraine of its sovereignty. That is, not allowing it to join NATO. Demilitarizing, which its military is trying to do it by hitting also military targets in Ukraine, and ultimately forcing it to become neutral, which the public opinion won't accept it, especially those attacks. So ultimately, those negotiations will fail. They keep failing. I don't see a situation in which the current Ukrainian government agrees on what Russia is trying to foist upon them.
Mark Voyger, really good talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us on Sky News tonight.
My pleasure.